This morning we're going to start something a little bit different than what normally happens during Sunday school, or than normally happens actually in most of the teaching settings of this church. As a Calvary Chapel, of course, what we're kind of known for is doing, verse by verse through books of the Bible. We're not going to be doing that for the next at least few weeks. We're going to be doing, I guess what you can call a topical study. And the subject of it is how we got our Bible. The reason for doing this, at least my reasoning for thinking it's important, is that the Bible is a historical book. It's not all history, of course. There's history, prophecy, doctrine, poetry in the Bible. But the vast majority of what is written in the Bible actually is written as an historical narrative. The confidence that we have in the truth of the gospel that we have put our eternity, our hope for our eternity in, is based in history. The book of Matthew, particularly, repeats the phrase, as it was written, or as the prophets had said, or as the prophets had written, multiple times. The difference between, one of the differences, and I think a major difference between other religions and Christianity, is that Christianity has a historical basis to it. Now, sometimes people look at me like, my head is, slightly cocked when I say that, because of course Islam has a history and Buddhism has a history, and we have fairly detailed records of what those histories are. All religions have a history. But what I mean by that is that you could say that the entire Old Testament exists as a recorded testimony pointing towards something that would happen later, in order that when it happened, people would be able to say that this had been prophesied, that this was based in previous people and events and locations, and it didn't just come out of thin air. There is a history to Islam. It has a history. Around 600 and something AD, Muhammad came out of the desert and started killing people. And so we have a pretty accurate history of how Islam began and how it was spread. And Muhammad, of course, wrote the Quran, and there's been much writing since then, religious and otherwise, that attest to the history of Islam. The difference is that there's nothing that came before Muhammad that said Muhammad's coming. There weren't centuries and millennia of prophets and writings and history saying there's a great event that's going to come. Christianity is the only religion, if you want to call it that has what we would call actually historicity to it, which is why it's believable. So, to me, that kind of begs the question, would it make sense for us to know the history of the Bible itself and where it comes from and what the basis for it is? And maybe I'm the only one in the room that thinks so, but I think so. Pastor Ray thought so because he asked me to teach this. So that's what we'll be doing for, I don't know, it's going to be 3, 4, 5 weeks. I'm not sure how long it's going to take to get through this. I'm going to start with some very, very basic stuff, which really has very little to do with the Bible itself, but just to give us some background and some understanding. And that is, we're going to begin today with actually the history of writing materials. And we'll see why that's important as we come down to the Bible itself, and there are two reasons. One is that the non-biblical record that we have of the history of writing materials is corroborated in the Bible itself. In almost every case, any type of material that history, artifacts, archaeology tells us from outside the Bible that were being used is mentioned also in the Bible. Now, look, you and I don't need to have outside sources say the Bible is right. Do we? I mean, I don't. I don't need someone outside the Bible to say, well, we make that mistake sometimes. Well, this very famous person is a believer in creation. That makes it more believable. No, it doesn't. If nobody else in the world believed it in creation, the Bible said so, then we should believe it, right? We don't need extra biblical sources. However, as we are, well, perhaps newer, younger believers, if our faith isn't quite that solid yet, or as we're talking to people about the Bible and explaining things, these things can have significance. That the Bible, even though it is not, its intent really isn't to be a history book primarily. It's really a spiritual book. Its intent isn't to be a scientific book or an archaeological book or a book of geography. It is good to know, isn't it, that all that stuff mentioned in the Bible, where it does mention science and geography and history and archaeology, lines up with what's being found in the rock layers and in the old parchments and stuff like that. The other reason is that the development of writing over a period of time and the things that writing, the medium that were used, the media that were used like stone and writing on gold and writing on paper and parchment, those sort of things had to develop to a certain point. About the time the Bible was written, history had to coincide in order for the Bible itself to be written and then to become widespread. And so that's why we're going to talk about this for a little while this morning. Bunch of different types of materials that were used for writing. The most ancient one, of course, you would probably guess, is just something you'd pick up off the ground and write on, and that's a rock. And so people used to write on stone, and we have a lot of evidence of those still left. One of the most famous ones is the Rosetta Stone, which has 3 different languages. It's how Egyptian, the language of Egypt, was actually deciphered, because the other languages, and I can't remember offhand what they are, it's written in 3 languages, including Egyptian, and that's how that language was deciphered. It was impenetrable, written in hieroglyphs, very hard to understand, but that was a very, very ancient document that was found that helped to decipher Egyptian. Now, in the Bible, we do find, obviously, the most, you probably guess what the first mention is, and that is the 10 Commandments. And they were written on tablets of stone, right? But stone writing has been around. The Hammurabi's Code, you remember 4th grade, you learned about Hammurabi's Code, the first set of laws actually written down, codified. It wasn't just a king, shooting from the hip, but actually had a set of laws that he himself was bound by. Was Hammurabi. That was the first Babylon, way back, 3000 BC. And that was written in stone. But in the Bible, the first mention is in Exodus 31. And it says there in verse 18, when the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. Now, we need to understand the first and second set of the tablets that came down didn't have the entire law, right? It's the 2 tablets of the law. The 10 Commandments were not written by Moses. Moses didn't go up there. Sometimes you see depictions in kids' books and stuff like Moses with a chisel or something. That's not how it happened. It said they were inscribed the first time and the second time. After Moses smashed them, went back up for another 40 days and 40 nights, were actually inscribed by the finger of God. God wrote in stone with his finger. Another very, very, very ancient form is ink on plaster, and that is also mentioned in the scriptures. In Joshua, or in Deuteronomy chapter 27, it says this, Moses tells Joshua, giving him his commission to take them into the promised land, when you have crossed the Jordan into the land the Lord your God is giving you, set up some large stones and coat them with plaster. Write on them all the words of this law when you have crossed over to enter the land of the Lord that your God is giving to you. Now, we don't have those anymore because plaster isn't that resilient. We even have frescoes that were painted in plaster 400 or 500 years ago, during the Renaissance, that are disappearing, that are falling apart right now. So we're talking about, 3,500 years ago here, and we don't have those anymore. But they are mentioned. This method is mentioned in history and, of course, here in the Bible as well. Another way to do it, a more permanent way to do it, was to fire clay. And some places you still find this being done. You would take moist clay and you would put your writing, most commonly, what you find in clay, the ancient stuff we have in clay is cuneiform. Now, the Egyptians had hieroglyphs, right? You had a picture of a sun and a picture of a dog and a picture of a house, and you put them together, and it meant a certain thing. It was a symbolic language. A bit more advanced than that was what developed up in the area of where Iraq is now, in Mesopotamia, where the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the really, really ancient ones, you may remember this from history, but going way, way, way back, the Akkadians, like way back at the dawn of history, they developed a process called cuneiform. and they had a stylus, like we have today with our, iPads. You get a little stylus for your thing. Well, the stylus just means pen in Latin, and it was a piece of wood or metal with a little sharp end on it, and you would take the stylus and you would press wedges, different shaped wedges in different arrangements to indicate a certain symbol. Now, you don't have an alphabet yet. That came along much later because the Egyptians had symbols for things. It's kind of hard to communicate subtlety using symbols. And that's why the language that has become the method of communicating around the world today that has taken hold first was French. French became really the first universal language in modern times, following upon Latin in its day. Okay, and Greek before that. Those are all languages of alphabets. And today, the language really that's taken hold in the whole world is what? It's English. If you want a job and all you got is a third grade education, just go across the water and you can teach English to somebody. I mean, they don't care if you got a degree or anything else. Everybody wants to learn English, right? So, of course, it has something to do with history and who conquered who. But the fact is, in an alphabetic language, you can take a letter that has a sound, A or A or A, whatever that sound is of that letter, O, E, T, D, and put them together, and you can make an infinite number of ideas out of that. Can't do that with symbols. It's harder. But the next step up the ladder in communicability of ideas was cuneiform. Because a cuneiform, when you made a house in Egypt, you had a picture of a house. In Assyria, a picture of a house was a series of wedges that indicated the idea of a house. It wasn't you weren't drawing a house. And you would use the exact same wedges to create the idea of a cat. And the same wedges arranged differently. So you're moving along the way of breaking the symbols down into finer and more discrete pieces so you can take all those pieces and put them together in a billion different ways and make different ideas. And that's really all that an alphabet is. It's a more sophisticated form, really, of cuneiform. So moist clay, you would put the cuneiform wedges, fire it. Ezekiel 4:1 was still being used at the time of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was around 700 BC or so. And it says, now, son of man, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. So it was still being used to communicate at that time. And some of these we still have. They became, integral parts of buildings, and we still have those. About 500,000 of them have survived to this day. Sometimes, by the way, interestingly enough, in leading up to the development of what we call a book today, long before Gutenberg came along, or the books, what they called codexes back in the Middle Ages, before they came along, they actually have found tablets of clay with symbols written on them and pictures with holes drilled in the corner and held together with a piece of leather or a rope, which is really an early form of a book. So we have stone, ink on plaster, we have clay, wood, another thing you can pick up off the ground. Numbers 17 verses 2 and 3 says this, speak to the Israelites, get 12 staffs from them, one from the leader of each of their ancestral tribes. Write the name of each man on his staff. On the staff of Levi, write Aaron's name, for there must be one staff for the head of each ancestral tribe. And in the Greek era and following on into the Roman era, they would use a board that was whitewashed. And so it was kind of like a chalkboard. And they would write on wood covered with some type of a paint or a whitewash. And that's where the word album comes from. That's Greek for board. And that became, a single thing with information on it, which is where the word album comes down. Of course, you younger people don't even know what an album is, because that's gone. Now we have CDs, and I guess we're beyond CDs, right? I've just read an article not that long ago about the death of the CD. Like, it's about ready to go bye-bye. So things are moving on. The inscription over Jesus' cross was on what the Romans would have called an album. Here is the King of the Jews, and then it was written out in several different languages. What the Romans did too, they went a little further with this. They would take a wooden block and they would hollow it out so that there was a depression in the middle, and they would pour wax in it, and then they would use that kind of like a tablet, to put impressions in as well. And they had a word for that, and they called that what today we would call a notebook. And you could carry that around with you. You had the wax. Wax wasn't really liquid. It's not solid. It lasted forever. And you could want to make a note, like, hey, honey, can you get eggs when we get to the market? Yes, dear, and put something on your list. You could carry it with you. Mostly it was scribes. It wasn't everyone carried. Imagine carrying this, probably kind of a bulky thing clanking against your knee all day long, but they were invented back then. Writing on metal, copper, silver, bronze, gold, all kinds of things. Exodus 28:36. Here's a reference. Make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it, as on a seal, holy to the Lord. When a Roman soldier got discharged from the army, he was given a little bronze tablet upon which would have been inscribed permanently. So permanent, you don't want to use, wax or clay can be broken. You want something permanent because it means your pension. It means, the land you're going to get for having served well or whatever. And it would list the rank, how he was discharged, what type of service he had, and what his benefits were in leaving. And that was called a diploma, which is where we get the word diploma. You get out of high school, how well have you served, what grade did you finish, what rights do you have, because that's where that word comes from the Latin. An interesting one is the scrap paper of the ancient world. The cheapest thing there was, and there was lots and lots and lots of, was broken pottery. And so they would call, potsherds, what, David said, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue is cleaving to the top of my mouth. Well, a potsherd would just be a broken piece of pottery, a vase or something like that, something of earthenware. And there was a lot of it because it was the cheap, it's like buying plasticware for a party today. I mean, it was just a lot less expensive than the other ways of making utensils. And so they would use it for scrap paper. Now, there's tons of these, billions of these in the ancient world. You find them all over the place. You can dig down any layer. You find these things. They're called ostraca. That's, again, a Latin word. But ostraca basically means waste. So it's a piece of paper, a piece of pottery. And a few of them, compared to the billions that are out there, have writing on them. People would scratch notes. We have some we found that have names of ancient people, probably a part of a vase and who it belonged to, or an expensive item of some kind. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in Athens, that's how they voted. You would get a piece of broken pottery, or you'd bring one with you, and the voting public, the few who were allowed to vote in their version of democracy, right? They would write down the names, they would put them in a container, and they would count those out just like we do, counting out slips of paper. But the way the term ostraca has come into our language as ostracize, when you're shunning somebody, because if someone was going to be banished from Athens, there was the ultimate punishment, short of getting your head chopped off, was to be banished from the city, which was their country, right? You were banished from your country because it was a city-state for 10 years. And so those who were voting would take a piece of ostraca and would write either yay or nay. It's like the black ball, white ball thing, and put it in the pot. And if you were voted out, then you were ostracized. And that's where that word comes from that we have today. Papyrus. This is one we're all more familiar with. Okay, papyrus is a reed. It grows in marshes. The largest marsh in that part of the world, which is a very dry part of the world, is obviously in Egypt, the Delta Nile. And there were two sections there at the head of the Nile where they grew papyrus, and Egypt basically owned the market on papyrus. And it was the best writing, by far and away, the closest thing to paper until paper was invented is papyrus. And you would take this reed, and it was like an onion in layers. You would slit it and open it up, and flatten it out, and then you would put a layer of these strips down, and then do another layer crosswise, and 3 or 4 layers, and you stretch them out and have them dry in the sun, and it turns into a usable piece of writing material. There's a Roman philosopher, his name is Pliny, and he actually left instructions. He was a papyrus maker, and he left instructions for exactly how to make papyrus. It's very light, very flexible, very thin, and very smooth. And it actually very old, also goes back to perhaps as far as 3000 BC. And that word is where we get the word paper from. And the Greek word for it is where we get the word chart and charter and that kind of thing, card. So along comes leather. Leather actually been around a long time. It's treated animal skin, of course. Parchment is different from leather, though. Leather is usually chemically treated. That's why, chemicals, and usually, quite honestly, the chemical back then was uric acid, so it was basically, camel pee is what they would use, or something like that, and you would soak the skin in that, and it would bring the tannin out and would render it nearly at that point useful for writing on. Some places, by the way, still use this method for curing leather. And how do I know that? because when Kelly went to India, she brought me back a present, and it was a belt that I still wear today, except I've had it now for about 10 years. It doesn't stink like pee anymore. But when I got it, I was like, very faint scent. I thought, well, I know how they cured that. Kind of an odd thought. Today, of course, we're more sophisticated. We have chemicals that do the same thing. But parchment is, instead of being chemically treated, is dried in the sun. And that's been around probably for about 1000 BC. But the perfection of this, interesting story. Parchment got perfected somewhere between 200 and 300 BC because at that time, one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world was the library at Alexandria in Egypt. It was by far and away the most famous, well-stocked, the pride of Egypt. And of course, they were in the business. They employed hundreds of scribes copying ancient documents. So they didn't have originals necessarily, but they had copies, and they were trying to copy every ancient document that existed, kind of like the Google project, right, where they're scanning every document in the world to make it available to everybody. And there was a guy named Eumenes up in Pergamum, which we know from the book of Revelation. One of those letters was written to the church of Pergamus, and he decided to build a library to rival the library in Alexandria. And the Egyptians were not happy about that. And so he was importing a great deal of papyrus, and they cut him off. They stopped exporting papyrus to outside of Egypt completely to stop Eumenes from doing what he was doing. So he put his guys to work, and they perfected the making of parchment, which was more expensive, but actually an even higher quality type of writing material. Vellum, you might have heard of that. It's kind of like veal, right? Kind of same word. You kill a really young animal. It has really nice skin, isn't scarred and beat up and too leathery yet. And that's very, very fine writing paper. My dad was in the printing business for years and years, owned a newspaper and a print shop. And I remember that vellum, the word is still used today. Any really, really, really expensive, fine piece of writing paper, even though it's not made of leather, is called vellum. So, New Testament books and letters, most likely written on parchment. Paul refers to this when he says, when you come, I'm sorry, did I say New Testament? Old Testament. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls, especially the parchment. So, of course, Paul was referring to the Old Testament books that he wanted delivered to them. So, we're not going to get into paper, because paper came about long after the New Testament itself was written, so who cares? We use it today. They tell me paper is on its way out, but I was actually in the paper business when my dad owned that stuff, and then I was in the copier business, which creates and copies tons of paper, and all I heard for years was the paperless office is on its way, and here it comes, it's coming down the road. And the more digital we've gotten, the more paper we're producing. Paper production and use is up in the last 20 years, not down. Why? Because now we have computers, and we can create stuff, and we print it. And everybody has a copier and a printer in their house, so we print stuff, even if we don't need to, right? Even me, I could be using a tablet, I suppose, but I prefer using the old tried and true method. Writing systems. Talked a little bit about cuneiform, been around about 3,000 years or more. Hieroglyphs, the Egyptians' hieroglyphs, the Assyrians, Babylonians, Akkadians up to the north and the east there, using cuneiform about the same time. Now, something you don't learn in history class, at least I don't remember, and I've mentioned it to 2 or 3 people who don't remember ever hearing this, is that the Jews invented the alphabet. How many people knew that? 2 or 3 out of 50, 60, whatever we got here, right? Why don't they tell us that? I'm not sure. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy, but why aren't they telling us? Now, it's not as if God showed up one day and said to Moses, or it actually, the Hebraic alphabet existed a couple hundred years before Moses came along, and said, okay, big things are happening. You're going to be coming out of Egypt pretty soon. You're going to need an alphabet to write down what I want to tell you. It's very nuanced and technical and complicated, and I've very subtle ideas. And so here's an alphabet. It's not as if out of nowhere Hebrew sprang into existence. There are these things called Proto-Hebraic that goes back a little ways. And the Egyptians actually probably, 1,000 years before the Jews went into Egypt in captivity. That was around Moses was 1400 roughly, right? So we're talking about 1800 BC. So about 1,000 years before that, the Egyptians had figured something out. They had this hieroglyph thing, right? And it's difficult to communicate ideas in hieroglyphs. They had begun conquering people. Egyptian, by the way, is extremely difficult to pronounce. Very hard language to pronounce. And so they actually invented a system of 20 or 23 or 4, I forget the number, of symbols that they would attach to words indicating how that word was to be pronounced. So you're like, kind of like an alphabet, right? Because an alphabet is nothing more than the symbols that represent sounds. And the sounds, when they put together in a certain way, then that represents the idea you're trying to convey. And so in order for foreigners to be able to pronounce their language and for them to be able to pronounce what we call borrowed words, imported words, they would attach these little devices that said, well, here's how this sound begins. They actually got to where they had developed over a few hundred years a couple of those symbols giving different sounds that said, here's the first beginning. And Egyptian always begins with a consonant. Egyptian, every word begins with a consonant. And so it began with a consonant followed by a softer sound, which we would call a vowel, that was an indicator, was a pronunciation guide. Okay? Not an alphabet yet. But the Jews, 400 years in captivity, obviously picked up the language, learned some things. And so a couple hundred years before Moses comes along, the Jews had developed a system of writing that is the Hebrew that we have today. And by the time Moses came along, of course, God had intended at that point for the Bible, for his communication with human beings now to be written down. This is a massive event in human history that goes completely overlooked, I think. God, throughout the history with mankind, had communicated through the oral, the spoken word. And it wasn't until the Jews were leaving Egypt, had left Egypt, that God, for the first time in history, said, I want you to write down what I'm saying. Now, there had been writing for centuries, for thousands of years, actually, before that. So it's not the first time that writing occurred, but it's the first time that God employed writing for his purposes. And you may say, why? Why would he do that? And if God does something, and it's a big change, well, it's got to be important. And the reason is what we began this lesson today with, because God was about to establish a historicity in order to validate the coming Messiah when the time came. So now he's saying, okay, I want you to write this down. And for the next 1,500 years, you guys are going to write stuff down and record, and you're going to prophesy. And when the Messiah finally comes, there's going to be this body of work that will be irrefutable, that will point to, prophetically, to the Messiah. Not only saying when he'll come and, the Daniel chapter 9 and how many days until he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey and, the prophecy, the circumstances surrounding his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection. All that's very important. The prophecies are critical. But also so that we now have in writing, no one's going to be able to say, well, the Jews never really had a Passover. They kind of invented that about the time of Jesus in order to match up to the story of Jesus, so the correlations would be really close. No, God had them writing about the Passover 1,500 years earlier, so that the typology, not just the prophecy, but all the typology leading up to Jesus would be irrefutably, historically, verifiably in writing. So that back then, the Jews would go, why do you think God instituted the Passover 1,500 years before Jesus? It doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it. If the point was to illustrate who Jesus would be and bring people to faith in Christ through the Messiah. The reason was God was going to have them celebrate the Passover, if they were faithful to do it, and they weren't, but for most of the years they did, for 1,500 odd years, so that it would be in the DNA, basically, of the people. And the world around them knew about it too. So that when Jesus came, everyone would go, it wouldn't be like, okay, let's try to figure this out. Lamb, Passover, blood, inspection, the priest. It was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is exactly it. And that was the point. I believe that was the point of God saying, okay, beginning now, I want you to write stuff down. Now, good trivia question would be, what do you think the very first thing that God told Moses to write down was? And the obvious answer that I would have said would be something about the Ten Commandments. But remember, he didn't write down the Ten Commandments. He wrote down the rest of the law, right? The design for the tabernacle, all that kind of stuff. That's what I would say. No. The Israelites leave Egypt, headed up to the Promised Land. It takes them 11 days to get to Kadesh Barnea, across from Jericho. They blow it. They wander for 40 more years. But they're on their way on that 11-day journey, and they're into it a day or two, and they get attacked by the very first group that attacks them are the Amalekites. Now, Israel won the battle, and God told Moses, write this. That's the first time in history God ever told anybody to write anything down that we're aware of. Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven, in Exodus chapter 17. Then, at Mount Sinai, he gives Moses instruction. But that happens in Exodus 34, in our way of figuring 17 chapters later. Not historically much later, because Mount Sinai came, immediately after they went into the desert as well. So Moses goes on and writes the first 5 books of the Bible. And that subset of biblical books is known by a few names. The Hebrew word is Torah, which means teaching or instruction. The Greek word is the Pentateuch. We hear that quite a bit. That literally means 5 scrolls. It's possible that Moses also wrote Job. We don't know for sure. Some people have speculated that he has. Job is most certainly, if not written by Moses, it may have been written by Moses, but if not, would be the oldest book of the Bible. But it became clear that God's intent was to leave a written record of his communication with men, because beginning with Moses, then you begin to read God's instruction over and over again. Joshua, who succeeded Moses, right, was told that he recorded things in the book of the law of God. The next reference, actually, we don't find many references, though there were people writing, but the next direct reference is in the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel was, a ruler in Israel who was the last of the judges before there were any kings. God appointed judges. Samuel was an Old Testament prophet and the last of the judges, and he ended his own reign, basically, by appointing the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and then David, in his place. He basically worked himself out of a job. It tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 10 that he explained to the people the rights and duties of kingship, and he wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. The next instruction we have, skip ahead again, because, Samuel had to be, around 1050 or 1100, something like that, BC, just before Saul and David. Jeremiah would have been alive at the time of the Babylonian captivity, so we're talking, 500 to 600 BC, so maybe 400 to 500 years later, after Samuel. And it says in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, take a scroll and write on it all the words I have spoken to you concerning Israel, Judah, and all the other nations from the time I began speaking to you in the reign of Josiah until now. So other prophets had written, of course, but the point of this is God changed his methodology and decided that we were going to write things down in order to accomplish certain purposes he had in mind. So we'll continue next week. Father, thank you for giving us the Bible. Lord, we ask that as we study about it, that you would deepen our appreciation for it, our understanding of it, and Lord, that as it becomes more and more real to us, that it would take higher and higher priority in our lives, and that as we read it, as we study it, as we hear it, as we recall it to memory, Lord, that it would take precedence over every other thing that we could, that might have an influence on our thinking, on our opinions, on our actions, on the way that we live our lives. Lord, let your word be preeminent in our hearts and our minds. As Jesus said to the disciples, Lord, it said that he opened their minds to the scriptures. We ask that you would do that for us in Jesus' name. Amen.